Hi everybody. Sorry I can't be there with you again today. Thankfully Miss McNeil could be with you yesterday and today, which makes things a little bit easier to have some consistency. I'm assuming you guys have finished going through the section on the invertebrates. So today I thought I'd send a little video along to introduce the vertebrates. So this section is the second part of section 6.3. So if you want to read up on it, and when you're asked to do the survey part, you'll find it around page 182 to 197. So when we talked about the invertebrates and vertebrates before, we said that most of the phyla that we were talking about, so the 8 phyla you've already talked about, make up the bulk of the animal kingdom. Only about 5% are vertebrates. And the vertebrates fall into phylum Chordata. Not all of the members of phylum Chordata are vertebrates, but a good portion of them are. So we're going to look at the features of chordates, which they're commonly called, but phylum Chordata, and why they're called phylum Chordata. So if you think of us as an example, you can think of the different characteristics that you'd have to fill in the chart if you did a column for phylum Chordata. So we are bilateral. We're triploblastic, meaning that we have 3 germ layers during our embryonic development. So that means that we can form more complex body forms with tissues and organs and things like that. We're coelomate, which, remember, means that we have a true body cavity that has a special tissue that lines the cavity but also surrounds the organs that are sitting in the cavity. We have a complete digestive tract, meaning that our food goes in one opening and goes out the other. And most tend to live on land. There are a few aquatic examples, but most tend to live on land. Even though there are fewer chordate species than invertebrate species, it seems like there's a lot more because the members of this phylum tend to be larger and we see them more often. So what we tend to think of most as animals are the vertebrates. So why else are they grouped in that group? There are 3 main things that happen in some stage in their life. They have a dorsal nerve cord, and basically that's our spinal cord, and becomes the brain and spinal cord in the more complex organisms like us. We have a notochord, and that's where the chordate name comes from. We have a notochord, I spelt it wrong, sorry, at some point in our development. And a notochord is a rod of cartilage that runs along the dorsal length of the body. In us, it becomes our backbone, but in some of the other chordate groups, some of the notochord is retained. So if it's retained in the tail, they're one group, tail area, or hind area. If it's retained in the head area, it's called another group. We also have gill slits early in our development. Thankfully, they close over in us, so we don't walk around with gills, but in some of the other vertebrates, they actually remain. So they become eustachian tubes in us. So the exceptions, there are 2 groups of invertebrate animals that are part of phylum Chordata, and they're considered invertebrates because they don't have vertebral columns. They don't have a fixed backbone like we do. The notochord remains. The tunicates and the lancelets are the 2 groups. One group are called Urochordata, so they have the notochord remains in the tail, and the others are Cephalochordata, and they have remaining in their head region. But ours becomes our vertebral column, so we are a subgroup that is the group of vertebrates. but they are still considered chordates because they have the 3 other characteristics. So, some of the features we're going to look at in terms of the vertebrate classes. The first is body temperature. So whether they're warm-blooded or cold-blooded, you've probably heard those terms before. So basically, if they're warm-blooded like us, then they're able to maintain a constant body temperature from within. So if we get cold, then we burn more food and carry out more reactions because they produce heat inside of us and raise our body temperature. The opposite is true if we get too warm, so that we can cool our body to a certain extent. And we like to have our body temperature remain fairly constant. There are a couple of other terms that they'll use to describe animals that are warm-blooded. One is homeotherms. Homeo meaning about the same. The other is endotherms. And endo means within or inside. So we maintain our body temperature from within. The other group would be cold-blooded. And the terms that mean cold-blooded are poikilotherms, and that's supposed to say ectotherms, E-C-T-O therms. So ecto meaning from outside. So cold-blooded organisms are organisms that need to have, their body takes on the temperature of their surroundings. So if their body gets too cool, they have to use a behavior mechanism usually. So in other words, they'll go somewhere that's warm. Maybe it's a lizard, and so they go and sun themselves on the rock in order to get warmed up. If they get too hot, then they might go in the water, or they might go under a tree so they can cool off. So the heat comes from outside of their bodies to try and get a relatively okay temperature. Another thing that we'll look at for each of the vertebrate classes is how they undergo respiration. In other words, how do they get oxygen into them and carbon dioxide out. The earlier or lower forms of vertebrates have gills. So you can probably think automatically of fish. But the gills are basically outgrowths that have finely divided surfaces that facilitate exchange of gases. So oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, when the water passes across the gills. Some have diffusion of gases through their skin. So we'll learn that frogs actually breathe through their skin, and that's why they have to keep their skin so moist, because they do have gas exchange through their skin. Lungs, like what we have, are more complex organs that are used to bring in oxygen and remove carbon dioxide, also that we can deliver it to our cells for cellular respiration, and then to remove the carbon dioxide that's produced from cellular respiration. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the different vertebrate classes and basically say, do they use gills? Do they use lungs? Do they use other forms like diffusion through their skin for breathing? Chordate circulation. Now, depending on how complex the vertebrates are, they may have a 2-chambered heart, or a 3-chambered heart, or a 3.5-chambered heart, or a 4-chambered heart. So obviously, 2-chambered heart is not as complex as a 4-chambered heart. Mammals, birds, and crocodiles have a 4-chambered heart. Like us, we are mammals, which is really super efficient because it prevents mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So we get the most oxygen that we can to our tissues. We'll be looking at the hearts in a little more detail when we go on to the next chapter, which is on human circulation. We have a two-way pathway for blood flow. So do amphibians and most reptiles. But they have more mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood because they don't have two separate pathways for the blood through the heart. The two-way path is there, but it's not complete. So I'll be able to show you a little better examples of this whenever I'm there and can actually point to things and show things a little bit better. But basically, adult frogs and other amphibians have a 3-chambered heart, and reptiles, all the reptiles except for crocodiles, have a 3.5-chambered heart, which means that it's almost a 4-chambered heart, but the 3-chambered heart is only partially divided. So there still is some mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So that means that the blood that goes out to the tissues isn't quite as high concentration of oxygen as it could be. So it's not quite as efficient. Fish have the simplest form of circulation. They have a 2-chambered heart, and there's only one pathway for the blood. So it gives in one chamber and out the other, and then around to the tissues, back in the one chamber, out the other, and around to the tissues. So it's kind of interesting when you think about, and we'll look at it a little more closely later, but when you look at the amphibians, their larval form or their younger form, like tadpoles, are like fish. So they actually have a 2-chambered heart when they're young, and then they undergo metamorphosis and develop a 3-chambered heart. So they become more complex. Hopefully you can see that cursor moving. This will make it a little easier for you to understand. So when they say, this is the heart over here for a fish. So you have one chamber here and one chamber here, and the arrows indicate the pathway of the blood. So blood comes back from the tissues, that's systemic blood. It comes back from the tissues into the atrium, then it goes down into the ventricle, and then it's pumped out to the gills and to the body tissue. So the pathway is a single pathway. One single pathway goes to the heart, out through the gills to the tissues, back to the heart. When we talk about the 3.5, or 4-chambered hearts, it's a little bit different. So this blue area is showing blood coming back from the body tissues. It comes into the right atrium and down into the ventricle. Okay, that green line is showing if it was a 3.5-chambered heart, then that bottom, the ventricle, is partially divided. So there's a wall that partially divides it. So it's not quite 4-chambered, but it's not just 3-chambered. It'd be 3.5. Anyway, the blood comes into the left side from the lungs, or from the gills in the early form of the amphibian, as it's becoming the adult. Okay, so it comes back into the left atrium, goes down into the ventricle. So both the blood from the tissues, which would have less oxygen, and the blood coming in from the lungs, which would have lots of oxygen, are allowed to mix down here in the ventricle. And then that mixed blood is sent out to the tissues. Okay, so there's one pathway here that comes to the heart, and then another that goes to the tissues. So we have pulmonary circulation, where the blood goes out to the lungs and back to the heart, and then we have systemic, where it goes out to the tissues and back to the heart.